Hey everybody, happy Wax on Wednesdays. This is the month of February and I thought it would be fun. I'm working on some larger projects here for spring and just do a little something different than your regular encaustic techniques, change it up a little bit. Sometimes it's fun to work outside of your medium and just do a little something different, free up your creativity and dive into something new. So this may or may not be new for you, but I just thought it'd be fun since I already did the collage last week with the encaustic and showed you how I do my encaustic collages here and how I finish them off. I thought it would be fun to show you how I finish my resin collages. There's so many different ways to finish collage pieces. Of course, you can varnish them. Encaustic, like I showed last week, is another different fun way to finish collage, and resin is also a wonderful way to finish collage pieces. And it's a completely different look from the encaustic. The resin one's gonna look quite different. So again, this is one of my puppy collages, and this one I did with all vintage wallpaper, and this one happens to be all vintage wallpaper from the 1960s. To adhere the collage, I always use Yes Paste. It's acid-free, and it's one of my favorite things to do. You can also thin it down with a little bit of water. It's really thick. When you use it, it's like thick Vaseline sort of thickness, very sticky, and it really works well for heavier papers especially, but it dries clear. I get asked that a lot. It does dry clear. It's acid free, and I've used this for years for collage, as do a lot of collage artists out there. And I let that dry completely before, usually overnight, and then the thing I want to do before I add the resin to this collage, and that's the most exciting part, is adding that resin and getting that wonderful glass-like finish. You really want to seal your collage with something so that the resin does not absorb into the paper. So when you finish a collage with encaustic, the encaustic does embed itself into that vintage paper, and it does darken the paper somewhat. So if this is not a look that you enjoy when it's sort of darkening those papers up, those vintage papers up, you may want to consider adding resin as a finish to your collage as opposed to encaustic. And I like it when the encaustic absorbs into the vintage papers because it's all organic. It's a very organic process. Encaustic is natural beeswax, and more resin and absorbing into that paper is just sort of gives an organic, creamy, dreamy feel to it. But when you have a clear sort of reflective surface, such as your resin finish, then usually it doesn't quite have the same look if that resin absorbs into that paper and darkens everything. It kind of looks oily if the resin absorbs into it as opposed to the encaustic. The encaustic, when the encaustic absorbs into the paper, it doesn't have that same sort of oily look. It does darken it, but it gives it sort of like a vintagey feel, and doesn't really look greasy or oily. And that's the only way I could sort of describe the way the resin looks when it absorbs into paper. So this sort of has that creamy, dreamy, vintagey feel with the encaustic. It does darken it, but it's not that sort of oily, greasy feel. When the resin absorbs into the collage papers, it kind of has like a dirty, greasy, oily look to it that's not necessarily what you want. So you want to go ahead and seal this, and when I'm sealing a piece, I usually seal it with matte gel medium. It really doesn't matter what brand. This is Liquitex. Of course, you can use a golden or whatever matte gel medium you have. Just some sort of sealant that's going to dry clear, and you want to make sure and look on the back of the package, because there's also, I think there's an ultra matte gel or something like that in the Liquitex that does not dry transparent. So you want to turn it over on both, and this should be the same on the golden as well. They're really good about listing exactly what the product is for, because when you have an entire line of mediums such as Liquitex and Golden do every single medium does a different thing or gives a different finish, a different look, you want to make sure and look on the back of the product and see that it's gonna do what you want it to do. And you wanna use it as a sealant, and you also want it to dry transparent. And here on the back, here it does say that it will, this particular product will dry transparent, and that's what you want. So I go ahead and give this 4 coats of, and this is an 8x8. This is an 8x8 piece, and I give it 4 coats. So I don't want to take the chance that once I add the resin that, you know, it's going to absorb right into his eye and something like that, or his nose, and completely ruin the collage. So I do 4 coats, and I do 1 each direction, and I let those coats dry completely in between. So yes, it does take up some time to let this matte gel medium dry completely in between. And so I let it, and then once I'm ready after that 4th coat, I'm gonna even let it set overnight and really let that dry before I go ahead and add the resin. Because once I add the resin, that moisture from the matte gel medium or the glue, or any moisture that's been incorporated into the paper, is not going to be able to seep back out. It's not going to be able to escape. Once you add that resin to the piece, it's going to be sealed in. So you really want to make sure that your piece is really, really dry before you go ahead and add any resin as your finish. So here I have 4 coats. They're completely dry, and from here you can give it, this is the same, if you were to varnish this piece, I would still give it 4 coats of matte gel medium if I were adding varnish to this piece, because the same rule applies where that varnish is going to seep in to the paper and sort of make it greasy and oily. I would still coat it with the matte gel medium before I went ahead and varnished it as well. So for this resin, I'm going to go ahead and add art resin. This is my the resin of choice that I use, but you can use any sort of 2-part epoxy resin to finish this piece. And this comes in bottles, it comes in smaller bottles, and it also comes in great big jugs. So the key to this is working it in 2 parts. This has a hardener, and it also has your resin part 1 and your hardener part 2. And so you're just gonna use equal parts of this, measure it out completely, really carefully, and then mix it up. And I have some already mixed here. So this has already been mixed up completely, and it's ready to go. You want to mix it. Most 2-part epoxy resins will say mix for 3 minutes. Most of the instructions on most of your resins will say mix for 3 minutes, mix for 5 minutes. Make sure that you mix for that full amount of time, that full 3 minutes, full 5 minutes, whatever it requires. And scrape the sides really well, because you don't want to take a chance that you didn't mix it up well enough and it's not going to harden on you, because once you put this on, it can't be removed. So it'll just be an eternal sort of sticky, mucky mess, and you can't fix it once that's been done. So make sure that you just take that extra time and mix it a full 3 minutes or whatever the instructions requires on your 2-part epoxy resin. And this can be really messy, so I have my tubs from the dollar store here ready, my yogurt cups. These are my pouring little trays, and I have lots of them in the studio. I just save my yogurt cups from my breakfast and use them for my resin pouring or my acrylic pouring. They work great in the little wash basins from the dollar store, and these are perfect, especially for this size. For 8x8 or smaller, fits right inside, and boom, you've got your area for pouring, and it's all nice and level. Make sure you check that with a level, so you make sure it's all nice and level before you go ahead and begin pouring. And I'm just gonna pour it right on there. If I make too much, if I don't make enough, then that's a problem, because it'll take a while to make up another batch. If I make too much, then I usually just have another piece ready to go. Maybe a smaller piece. Maybe if I just have a little extra, I have a smaller piece that can be ready, that I can add some resin to really quick and not waste any of that expensive 2-part resin. I just did that with my finger. You can get a squeegee or an old credit card or a tongue depressor or anything you like and sort of spread that and make sure it's even. Normally, I just poured this, and normally I would have showed you, and that's what I had planned to do with the painter's tape, is show you that I tape off the sides like I did on the collage piece last week, and guess what? I forgot to do that. So I also sand my edges when I'm done, so it's really not a problem. I just kind of makes a little bit of an extra step, a little bit of extra work. I have an electric sander with a sand belt, so I'll just run this piece over the sides and sand off the sides if there's any drips from this resin. It's really not a big deal, it just makes a little bit of extra work. But you can tape off the sides with painter's tape and avoid that mess. And just tape off your sides. And a lot of people also ask how I frame these. Well, you can just simply, on the cradle boards, you can just simply paint the sides if you want. You can also place them in a float frame, which looks really nice, and that's what I usually do. For those of us who work with Encaustic all the time and we want to get, everything fused really well with the wax, today I'm using the torch really far away, and I'm just trying to get those air bubbles out. And you'll see with this brand of resin anyways, that the air bubbles come out really easily. It doesn't need a lot of heat, and you don't want to burn your resin or your piece underneath. You just want a light amount of heat to sort of make those bubbles pop, those air bubbles pop, and get rid of them. I'm not trying to heat up the resin in any way. So I sort of have it on a medium light flame. And you can see those air bubbles just go away really quickly. Sometimes it's easier if you're looking at those air bubbles and you're trying to get rid of them. And again, you don't want to heat up your resin. Bend down and sort of look level with your piece and see if you got all of those air bubbles out. So look at it from all angles. Do it in an area where you can sort of walk around it on all sides and kind of look at it really carefully and see that you've gotten out all of those air bubbles, and that you're not missing, that there's not any areas that you're missing resin. There's no pockets of missing resin anywhere. But you can see how clear that got really fast. No more air bubbles. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes and check that again and make sure no more bubbles have popped up. So this is gonna give it a really pretty glass-like finish. I usually give it a couple of coats of this resin. So this resin takes 3 days to fully cure, and after 24 hours you can go ahead and add another coat of resin to it, but it takes 3 days to completely cure and be finished. So make sure that you put it in an out-of-the-way place. Now the fun part about resin too is that if you want to, after this is dry, after this is cured for 72 hours, then you can come back and add another layer of collage to this and layer it right on top of the resin. When that's dry, you can put another coat of resin on top of that. So that's kind of fun too. But I usually give just a couple coats of resin as a finish. You can keep going and add as many coats as you want. It depends on the depth effect that you want on your collage. So some people add 2, 3 coats. I usually, on a small piece like this, I usually will add 2 good coats of resin, and that's usually my go-to when I'm putting a finish on my collage pieces. But I also want to make sure that no dust or anything gets into my piece while it's drying. And so if you have, you can hear in the background, you can hear puppy snoring. So I want to make sure that no puppy hair gets into my puppy collage. So what I usually do is you want to completely cover this. And this doesn't actually have, these are great for pouring in, but it doesn't have a flat surface. It's got these little raised handles here, so it's hard to put something on mine just flat over it and have absolutely nothing get into it. So this is, you know, pretty sturdy. It's not a pour or anything like that where you don't want to jiggle it too much because the pour will move and you don't want to move the paint. You want to keep it stationary and all that. This is just a resin finish. So I can pick this right up and put it in a clear large tote, is what I usually do, is get those clear large totes from Costco or wherever and put the whole thing, just the whole thing right in this, you know, using the tray and everything, because it's sitting nice and level. It's all leveled out. It's all good where it is. But I take this whole unit, pick it up, put it into the clear tote, and then cover the tote with the lid. And that way I can see what's going on inside. And I don't know why, I really don't need to see what's going on inside, but it does have light. And also it's protected from all dust and everything while it's drying. Nobody's gonna bother it. It's completely safe while that resin's drying, because there's nothing like coming back to it a few hours later and seeing that there was a little speck of dust or piece of fuzz, or you know, something, or a puppy hair or an eyelash in your collage piece forever and ever and ever. So make sure that it's just one headache out of the way if you put it in a nice safe place and cover it up, and it'll have a wonderful glass-like finish. And if you'd like to see more of this type of video where it's just every once in a while just a little something different, a little different technique for you to use in your own creative space, then let me know in the comment section down below, and I will see you next week. Happy Wax on Wednesdays.